I am to be present at this occasion. I've had a long association with Korea. From 1985, I ran the Korean program for the World Bank and have been a great admirer of President Park Chung-Hee because without him, there wouldn't have been a Korean economic miracle. So I am extremely honored that Dr. Chua invited me to this meeting to pay my respects to this great man. Now, I provided a paper which has been published in the conference volume, and I don't intend to read it because it would take much too long and it would really bore you. Besides, there's no need to go into the figures and reiterate them because Professor Shujin has provided an excellent summary over here, which all of you should have or look at or something. He provided an excellent capsule of the data. So instead of doing that, what I'm going to do is to concern myself with three issues, which I think would be very fitting for this occasion. The first issue I want to look at is how should we honor President Park? How should we honor his memory? The second is, in furtherance of the first, how could Korea help other countries? And the third is, what should Korea do to help get for itself due respect and its due place in the world's Committee of Nations? Now, all these are rather large questions, and obviously within my 15 minutes I'm not going to be able to answer them. But let me suggest some points that should get you thinking. So let me first begin with what, in my view, we should do to honor President Park. My view is that President Park was a great visionary, and that what he was out to do for Korea primarily, initially, but it would also extend to other countries, is that he wanted to change the past for them. He wanted to make the future better than the past. So instead of going through what he did for Korea, which everybody else will talk about, but I'm sure most of you know better than I do, I want to focus on the future. What lessons from Korea's experience can we extract that other countries would find useful to make their futures better than their past? Now, the second thing is that you would be amazed how many countries not only in East Asia, but all over the world, how many developing countries are keen to learn from Korea's experience. In the paper, I've harped a lot on Egypt simply because it was the most recent country that asked me this question. But looking through my notes, I mean, exactly the same question was asked by Dr. Mahathir, the Malaysian Prime Minister, Vo Van Kiet, the Vietnamese Prime Minister, President Zardari of Pakistan, Atif Ibed and Kamal al-Ganzouri, both Prime Ministers of Egypt, Fakhruddin Ahmad, the President of Bangladesh, and there were others from Laos and Cambodia and Myanmar and other countries, and I don't have to go into details. I just want to impress on you that the Korean experience has made a great impression on many other countries in the world who would like to know much more about how Korea did it. Now, this isn't just small countries, I mean, around Southeast Asia that have done it. The Chinese were extremely interested in this, and in 1987, I had a conference in Bangkok to bring China and Korea together to discuss the Korean experience and to answer the questions of China. And it was particularly important because at that time there wasn't recognition between the two countries. The conference was so successful that on the second day, the Chinese delegates were talking about our Korean friends and our Korean colleagues and asking for various papers to be sent via Hong Kong. So Just the exchange of information on Korea's experience led to a great deal of friendship between the officials at that party, at that meeting. And it also led to invitations for some of the leading Korean officials to visit China as international observers because of, obviously because of the lack of recognition at that time. The official advisors from Korea who went over there were Kim Man-jae, Jin Nyom, and So Sang-mok. Now, this was so successful that when the Vietnamese were thinking of changing their economy more towards a market economy, they asked me to arrange a similar meeting for them. So 2 or 3 years after the initial Bangkok meeting, I arranged a meeting in Kuala Lumpur for the Vietnamese. And at that conference, we had the Indonesians, the Koreans, the Vietnamese. And again, it was so successful that when the Vietnamese began moving towards a more market-oriented society, Vo Van Kiet, who had led the delegation and had now become Prime Minister of Vietnam, said to me quite explicitly that it was discussions with the Korean delegates at that meeting which helped him to convince other members of the government on moving towards this new economic regime. Because they had been concerned extremely, they had been mainly concerned with questions of control. That we have a communist economy, we can issue orders and more or less we can stop things from going in the direction of collapse. But what happens if you have a market economy and things start going bad? Then what do you do? And he said that the answers that the Korean delegation gave him in particular reassured him that everything wouldn't go to hell in a handbasket, to use the American phrase, and that the matters could be contained and that matters could be kept in check. So even in the 1980s, late 1980s, the Korean experience was being looked at very keenly by other countries. Now, this brings me to what exactly is it of the Korean experience that one should highlight? Because the first thing that one should learn from Korea's experience, and indeed in any country's experience, is that there is no silver bullet. There is no one policy, there is no one strategy, there is no one direction that you can follow and voila, you're developed. You have to take the lessons and modify them for your own particular conditions, what is unique to your own country, and then apply them. But I would say that there were 6 issues that emerged from Korea's experience that are universal and that could be applied to almost all of them. The first issue that I have stressed to all these leaders with whom I've spoken is that leadership is the most important issue. You have to have a leader who has a vision of where he wants his country to go. And he must have the strength to prevail over factions that stop it from going over there. I once had a talk with the president of Daewoo Heavy Industry, and he asked me a very pertinent question. He said the world thinks that the Koreans are worker bees. They get up at 6 in the morning, they go to work, and they work all day frantically, and then they go home at night at 12 o'clock, collapse in bed, and next morning start again at 6. He said, if we were like that, why weren't we always rich? Why have we been so desperately poor? He said, what you've got to look at is what set of incentives and disincentives converted a country that, in his words, was addicted to gambling, women, and drink into this country of worker bees, of intellectuals, of thinking people, dedicated people, hardworking people, punctual at work people. So I think that this is the importance of leadership, of providing the right kind of incentives and disincentives that can turn within one generation a desperately poor country into a country that is an aid donor to much of the world is the first important lesson that one has to look at. Unfortunately, leadership is not something that you can be trained into. I mean, you pretty much either have it or you don't have it. And Korea was extremely lucky to have President Park Chung-hee, who had these qualities. The second question, I would say, is that the leader has to focus on what is important, on what is critical, and single-mindedly move aside all other things that might look attractive, all other policies and goals and targets that might appear attractive, but for him must be secondary. I mean, President Park had the idea that to be a strong country, you had to have a strong economy. You couldn't even have a strong army without a strong economy, because a modern army is based on technology. Look at the policies he followed. Since 1953, there has been no hot war between North and South Korea, despite the provocations that South Korea may have suffered, including an assassination attempt. Was it in 1968 that they reached the Blue House thing? Because war would have interrupted the economic drive. So no matter how strongly he felt about the provocations, this is secondary. To the Egyptian prime minister, as I said, that on the other hand, you've had wars with Israel in 1948, in 1967, and in 1971. You wanted to be leaders of the Arab world. You wanted to be leaders of the Islamic world. You wanted to be leaders of the African world. You wanted to be leaders of the non-aligned movement. You've had a war with Saudi Arabia and Yemen. You've also had a war of attrition with Israel that lasted for a year and a half. You've had a war with the French and the British. Don't you think these are distractions from economic development? I said every country has the right to follow whatever foreign policy it likes. I mean, you're a sovereign country. But policies have consequences. And you have to live with the consequences of the policies that you have adopted. That is lesson number one. That we have to be adults. President Park Chung-hee was an adult. He knew what the opportunity cost of diverting himself from economic development was. Again, everyone knows about the history of Japan and Korea. I have no need to and no desire to rerun that. But after the Second World War, obviously there was very strong feeling in Korea about the rapprochement with Japan. But President Park Chung-hee realized he needed Japanese technology, Japanese money, and Japanese market. And although the demands for reparations from Japan ranged from $2 billion that President Syngman-rhee wanted to, $350 million that Japan was prepared to offer, he reached a compromise of $800 million and settled the matter despite the political opposition that he faced. Because remember, when he settled this matter of $800 million, Korea's exports were less than $300 million. And it opened up technology, it opened up a market, it opened up many other things. A former Korean deputy prime minister told me that the instructions to Korean ambassadors when they went out to their postings were very simple. They were in fact two. Instruction number one, prevent your host country from recognizing North Korea. Instruction number two, increase South Korean exports to your country. Full stop. I mean, this is, let's keep our focus on the development part. Let's forget high politics until we are economically strong and economically independent. So I told these leaders that you have to have a strong leader who has a clear vision of where he wants the country to go and is prepared to put aside all other issues that might appear politically attractive but will get in the way of his achieving his primary goal. This also leads to an associated issue of experience from Korea, and that is pragmatism. The world isn't perfect. Justice isn't always delivered 100% to everybody. You've got to make the best deal of whatever is circumstances are going to offer you. I mean, the example I gave of cutting a deal with Japan is one element, one example of that pragmatism. Secondly, when the American army needed support in Vietnam, the president provided up to 50,000 Korean troops. Not because he was going to, start World War III or anything, but because that continued the funding and the technology and the markets and the defense support from the United States. Then, sorry, let me jump over these because I have a limit of 15 minutes. The third issue that one can draw universally from the Korean experience is hard work. I worked on about 25 countries for the World Bank, and never have I seen a country that has been so successful with so few natural resources. Basically, Korea has zero natural resources in any significant measure. An advisor to President Park once said, we have nothing except the brains of our people and the hard work of our hands. And the Korean example for any economist particularly is such a shining example because it shows what policy, good policies and hard work can achieve despite the absence of natural resources. Korea is a fantastic laboratory for looking at the effectiveness of economic policies and the implementation of economic policies. The fourth lesson is the importance of education. On a personal note, the first time I came to Korea in late 1984, I was surprised to see that Korean business cards carried the degree of the person who it was. He was a BA, he was an MA, he was a PhD, he was whatever. Because in the West, this is just not done. You have your name, you have your organization's name, and you have your phone number, and that's it. But it's a measure of how important education is to the Koreans. And one has to respect that. Because I have a figure over here which is quite striking. In 2012, 2013, the Korean government contributed 5% of GDP to education. The average for most developed countries is around 4% or so. But families contributed another 3% of GDP. And what's more, for after-school activities, family contributed 8% of the household budget per child. Now think of it. It meant that a family that has 3 children would have to devote a quarter of its household budget just to the after-school education and after-school activities of the child. This is far beyond any country in the West or any other country does. And once more, it underlines the sacrifices that Korean parents are prepared to make for the future of their children. And it underlines the importance that they assign to education in that future. The next question, and this comes up with every country that I've worked on, is how does Korea achieve its export miracle? Now, that is a subject that merits several hours of discussion, and of course we don't have those. But the main point I think that every country I worked on has missed is a philosophical point, if I may call it that President Park Chung-hee grasped and that every other country that I worked on has missed. And that point is that in a modern economy, a major export drive can be founded, can be based on imports. Any other country that you speak to, they say exports have to be based on raw materials that are indigenous to the exporting country. You take, the oil producers, well, if you don't have oil, you don't have exports. If you take Egypt, for long periods, for 100 years, cotton and raw cotton and cotton textiles dominated the export picture. Ditto in Pakistan, jute in Bangladesh. But what President Park Chung-hee grasped was that even if you have nothing, you can import raw materials and semi-finished goods, have a trained and efficient and hard-working labor force that adds value, and export these at a competitive exchange rate. That is the essence of the Korean export miracle. And this is a lesson that I think any other country in the world should be prepared to learn, because far too many of them spend their time appreciating the exchange rates under the idea that this is some kind of macho thing to do, not realizing that they're undercutting their own export drive. The last point that I want to mention is the importance of investment and savings in an economy. And actually, this is another way of saying the importance of the weight you give to the future generations. Because what you save essentially means you reduce your own consumption. But that is so that you can increase investment, so that your future generation can have a higher income and a higher standard of living. And when you see that Korean investment and Korean savings have gone up from 8% in 1950 to 35% until recently, and savings have followed those, you understand again the discipline that this country has and the importance that it gives to the future of to its future generations, that it's prepared to cut its own consumption so massively just to give a still better future for its next generation. Now, I'm not sure how much this sort of list was appreciated by the people I spoke to, because all of these involve hard work, thinking, sacrifice, whereas what most politicians want is a quick magic bullet that penalizes nobody and yet gives them nirvana. Well, it doesn't exist. That's a lesson from the Korean experience. The final point that I want to do is, what should Korea do to obtain its due place in the world? Because I think that Korea is punching below its weight, as the Americans say. That Korea should be held in much higher esteem, respect, and listened to than it does at present. Korea is much too shy. I think the first thing that Korea should do is to share its experience much more widely. I'm not saying Korea should go around dishing out more money. I think Korea should go out dishing out its experience. And this can bring immense diplomatic gains. I can cite an example from my own country, Pakistan. In 1963, Pakistan had ambassadorial level relations with North Korea and only consular level relations with South Korea. Just 1 minute, I won't take more than that. Thank you. But then a Korean delegation under Mr. CHUNG-HEE visited Pakistan to discuss, what Korea could teach and what Korea could learn and how things could be improved. That visit was so successful that very soon afterwards, the Korean diplomatic representation was raised to ambassadorial level. So countries do respect this kind of interaction, and very tangible diplomatic benefits are forthcoming. The second thing is that I think Korea should do much more to export its culture. And by culture, I don't mean that you go around the world teaching everybody to sing Ari Ram. I mean, although that's not a bad idea too. But to my mind, Korean culture is punctuality, hard work, integrity, emphasis on education, discipline, things like that. These are things that now are innate in the Korean, and that these things these ideas transferred to other countries would do them immense good. My final point is that Korea should take a more active role in the intellectual debate concerning the theory of economic development. I'm sorry if Dr. Jwa is going to be embarrassed, but I'm going to point to his work as one example in which he breaks with, in many ways, he breaks with established thinking, because established thinking cannot explain so many things. But we should have more of that. And people like Dr. Jwa, and the KDI, and so on, should draw on the Korean experience to see how it can enrich the theory of economic development. Thank you very much.